Hey everyone, the last video was about Plato's life, and in this video we are going to discuss Plato's theory of imitation or mimesis and his thoughts about poetry and other art forms. So if you haven't watched that video, I would suggest that you watch that one first and then return to this one. I have put a link in the description box and on the I button above. Also, if you have time, then please watch the video complete. I have tried to explain the theory in detail, so the video is going to be very interesting. Now, let's begin with the video. The Socratic Dialogues. Plato, as you all know, was a great philosopher, and much of his philosophy is written in forms of dialogues. He wrote in all 36 dialogues. These dialogues were between Socrates, his guru, and someone else. Basically, in these dialogues, Plato showed Socrates discussing over various topics and subjects with the people of Athens and various foreigners. One of the most famous dialogues of his is the Republic. It is divided in 10 books. Plato never wrote any work on criticism, but the reason he is called as the first critic of poetry is that he focused on criticism of poetry and other arts in the second, third, and 10th books of the Republic, and also in another dialogue, Iron. This is where we get to know about his theory of mimesis. Mimesis is a Greek word which means imitation or to copy. In this theory, Plato objected to poetry and other art forms like painting. Plato declared them nothing more than the copies of original. He also said that these art forms were totally useless. He even went a step further and said that the life of a poet should be less than 50 years. Here, it is to be noted that before meeting Socrates, Plato himself wrote poetry which he destroyed after meeting Socrates. So, what could have been the reason behind doing so and criticizing poetry and other art forms so harshly? And on what grounds was Plato objecting to poetry? He basically criticized poetry on three bases: educational, philosophical, and moral. The Republic was written during a time when Athens was continuously downfalling. In Plato's opinion, art should leave a positive impact on the society. It should praise the good and the virtuous and discard all the bad things and immoral things. Criticizing Homer, Plato says that Homer and the conventional mythology shows imperfections even in the gods and heroes. Homer's work represent gods not as examples of virtue but as models of depravity, which has a corrupting influence on the youth and the uneducated people. Such literature should not be taught to students, and what should be taught at the early stages of their education is models of virtuous behavior. Only what is good should be attributed to gods, according to Plato. In this way, he criticizes Homer's poetry and poetry in general from the educational and moral points of view. He disapproves of poetry, stating it immoral. And being a philosopher, he objects to poetry because he thinks poetry is based on falsehood. He considers idea as the real truth. And philosophy better than poetry because philosophers deal with the ideal truth, whereas poets deal with illusions, according to him. To justify his point, he gives the famous example of a chair and a carpenter, in which he says that the idea of a chair first came in the mind of a carpenter. And when the carpenter made the idea of the chair concrete using wood, that physical chair becomes the first copy of the original idea, or what we can call an imitation of the idea, which is removed from reality, which is not real. And when a painter paints that chair, he is just painting the superficial appearance of the idea. He is painting an imitation of the original idea. In his opinion, only the idea was original and the physical chair was a copy of the idea, and the thing which the painter painted was copy of a copy. So his painting becomes an imitation of an imitation, hence twice removed from reality. He compares the work of a poet to that of the painter and calls poetry as an imitation of an imitation, or a copy, which is nowhere connected to the original. In the beginning of the book 10 of the Republic, he gives another example, the example of a bed and a table. In this example, he says that there are many beds and tables in the world, but the idea is a single one, which is made by God. When a craftsman produces a bed and a table, he uses that idea. And there is another artisan who reproduces the work of the craftsman, looking at it and just as it would appear in a mirror. This is what a painter or a poet does. The craftsman's work has utility, whereas the work of a poet and painter has no utility. In this way, Plato also divides art on the basis of its usefulness and uselessness. In Ion, he ridicules the work of reciter of epic poetry, Ion. This man, Ion, recited the poetry of Homer very nicely, but he could not recite the poetry of any other poet. Socrates, in this dialogue of Plato, tries to prove that Ion has no real knowledge, and even poets don't have any real knowledge. To write and recite poetry, they are inspired by God. They themselves are far away from reason and logic. Sometimes, poets themselves can't understand what they have written. He calls poets as insane, and such works of insanity, in his opinion, can never be good. Plato considers philosophy much better than poetry because philosophy is the only thing which deals with the idea, which is the real truth, and considers poetry as mother of lies and poets as the breeders of falsehood. Because, in his opinion, poetry is nothing more than a copy of a copy. Later in Poetics, Aristotle gives his views on poetry and disagrees with Plato, calling poetry mere an imitation. We will talk about it some other day. So that was all for this video. If you found the video useful, then show your love by subscribing to the channel if you haven't yet. And you can also share it with your friends. We will meet soon in another video.